This section is going to be more analytical. Instead of presenting scales and demonstrating their usage over chords, I think now is the proper point to discuss what a scale is and what conception we have of it. The next section will be on using mellicarta as supertonic scales and the remaining pentatonic supertonic scales that I did not cover in part 2. I have chosen this spot because in my view music is firstly empirical, then analytical. In other words, one grows up in a certain musical climate and then is given tools from culture and from the reason natural to humanity, and from these one can come to certain understandings. Eventually one grows to the level where one can abstract the ideas from their existence in reality. And that is what I mean these previous parts to be, an analysis into the full breadth of scalar theory for Westerners. Including the full set of pentatonic scales, their supertonic usage, and mellicarta is done in so seeking to cover all possible bases and to lead one into the ideas I will present now. We must first point out what assumptions we have about scales. Firstly, that a scale must go up and down in the same form. Secondly, that a scale must repeat at the octave. Thirdly, that all notes of a scale must sound the same regardless of the context in which they are played. In other words, the notes of scales are like that of the strings of a zither. I have discussed and demonstrated 156 different scales, and so to generate directional scales, those with 2 different scales for up and down, using our previously mentioned scales would give us 24,000 directional scales. In my view, discussing these and multi-octave scales is not particularly useful. It is useful, however, to point out some of the basic types of these and of what form they exist. For directional scales, the most common one in Western music is classical melodic minor. It is melodic minor up and an aeolian down. Generally, there are 2 different ideas for directional scales. The first applies to the melodic minor, that is, that the upwards direction should pull the melodic nature of the scale up, usually with sharps, and the downwards direction should pull the melodic nature of the scale down, usually with flats. This is more commonly done with a single change, though, between the scales. Take the directional scale Ionian up, Mixolydian down. The major 7 pulls the melody of the scale up to 1, and the minor 7 pulls the melody of the scale down to 6. The other common way that directional scales are made is to take a septatonic scale for one direction and a pentatonic scale for the other. It is important to note that the pentatonic scale in this case is usually derivative of the septatonic scale. For example, Lydian up, Lydian no 2 no 6 down. The problem I have with directional scales is that generally the directionality is fuzzy. In Bach's music, one can hear many usages of the classical melodic minor scale going downwards, sometimes for a brief moment of a fall leading to a rise, and other times in a complete fall, but with a natural 6 and natural 7. In other words, its use is similar to that of a raga, in that it provides information more than that of a scale, and it is really a performer or composer who has to interpret for themselves and to their own taste what the scale means. For most of music history, scales have been 1 octave long, with no intention on the performer or composer for multi-octave use. But in scalar development, many cultures came up with scales that were an octave and a fifth, or even 2 octaves. Generally, these octaves were not the same. The lower extensions tend to have less notes, and the higher extensions tend to have more notes, in a similar fashion as our harmonic series. One should note here that I am referring to traditional zither instruments, primarily. The basic kind of these scales that lasted throughout the years was a 2-octave scale, the upper octave having a single note lowered or raised. For example, the 2-octave scale Mixolydian Dorian, the spelling of the scale being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8, 9, flat 10, 11, 12, 13, flat 14. One should ask, are these scales particularly common, or are they rather just a mental exercise? The answer is simply that they are very common. For instance, the last scale discussed, the 2-octave scale Mixolydian Dorian, if one thinks about blues, one can get an idea about what this scale is going for. Generally, blues uses a flat 3, but it's very common to substitute the 3 for the lower octave. The blues scale leads to the last assumption for scales. The blue note, sharp 4 or flat 5, is actually in practice higher or lower depending on its use. Generally, it's slightly lower than its tempered equivalent, but when leading to the 5, it's higher and more in line with our tempered system. One could spell the scale as 1, flat 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, flat 7, 1, flat 7, 5, flat 5, 4, flat 3, 1, and retain a similar idea with our notion that sharps go up and flats go down. It is not uncommon to hear instruments without restrictions on pitch like that of the piano to play the note sharper or flatter depending on their idea of it, even unconsciously. Here is where we get to my main point, that a scale is an instruction. It's a guide towards achieving a certain sound. A scale can repeat at the octave because that doesn't affect the impression one gets as a listener. It still sounds like the same scale. The problem with scales is that they are in poor instruction for most real music. The classical melodic minor scale will not help one compose in the style of Bach. It is far more important to understand the traditional rules of voice leading and counterpoint. In the same way, understanding Malakarta will not give you the insight that understanding the ragas they produce will. Understanding the blues scale will not give you the ability to play blues at any high level. The blues scale should really contain all of the possibilities for blues. It should really be spelled 1, 2, flat 3, 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 1, flat 7, 6, 5, flat 5, 4, 3, flat 3, 2, 1. All of those notes are played at a blues concert, but they are not played equally. That is the main problem with scales, is that they are written out as if to be played in a random way. The blues scale, in fact, contains the most important notes, omitting the 2, 3, and 6, although it doesn't really describe how to handle the flat 5. In my view, there is no best way to describe all of the things that good blues players know. Instead, the better thing is to listen to the music and to not rely on the scale, but relying on your ear instead. Now that I've put my time in to throw water on scales, I should be clear that scales are very much a useful thing. One could not come to the understanding above without first a firm grasp on scales. It would be like a crawling baby criticizing a man for running improperly. The thing to be mindful of is that scales are generalizations. They are useful for broad understanding, but should be discarded if necessary in any specific application. Scales only really apply to zithers, instruments with a single string or pipe for every note. Thus, these instruments must be tuned to a particular scale, and there is very little around this in general. One should note, however, that most music stems from two particular human instruments, the voice and the hands and feet. The hands and feet are purely rhythmic, but the voice has no scale for its tuning. In actuality, the voice can be tuned to any scale with enough skill of the singer. One might say that the singer uses a particular scale, but there are many microtonal variations possible. And for a musician, the great pleasure is not in the structures placed over the music, but in fact the music as reality itself.